Staying the distance. Ronnie Delaney was born in Arklow, County Wicklow, but grew up in Sandymount, Dublin. He won a gold medal in the 1500 metres running event at the 1956 Summer Olympics in Melbourne, Australia. The following extract from his autobiography, Staying the Distance, recounts that famous race. He went on to win a bronze medal at the 1958 European Athletics Championships in Stockholm. He retired from competitive athletics in 1962, yet remains one of Ireland's most recognisable Olympians. In the early evening of the 19th of November, we arrived in the Olympic City to a tumultuous welcome from the many Irish-Australian societies. There were Irish pipers and colleens dressed in national costume on hand for the occasion. The Irish Down Under were thrilled to see their old country represented in the Games. They extended to us the heartiest of good luck and best wishes. We arrived at the Olympic Village and settled in immediately. We were tired and needed to rest up after our long journey. But before going to bed, we raised an Irish flag outside our quarters. As it so happened, it was the largest flag put up. The other nations had standard-sized ones. Before we knew it, every newspaper man in the village was outside photographing it. It caused a sensation. Next morning, matters were put right, or wrong, depending on which way you look at it, when the camp commandant came along with the proper-sized flag. He took our big one down and went through a formal ceremony of unfurling the new flag. My first days in the village were filled with meeting members of the other nations' teams whom I already knew. It was great seeing my teammates from Villanova. Charlie Jenkins and Phil Rivas were both competing, of course, for the US, United States. Charlie had a store of information on my opponents. He had done some research for me. He told me Landy was having trouble with his legs, Bailey was having trouble with his nose, and that the 1-2 threat of the Australians was considered weakened. Rosavogli and Tubori of Hungary and the British team of Hewson, Wood and Boyd were all thought highly of by the experts. The tension in the village itself was electric. All about me were lean, strained faces with eyes sunk deep from the long hours of training. Everywhere there was talk of who would win this and that, all of which, if you listened to it, would only make you twice as nervous and tense. For the most part, I kept to myself and my Irish teammates. Shortly after my arrival in the village, I met the three Britons, Hewson, Wood and Boyd. Despite our centuries of difference, we Irish and British were friendly to one another. They were all talk about who was going to win the 1500 metres and mentioned everyone's name practically. I gathered they were in a state of high tension, and when they asked me who I thought would win, I announced blandly, myself. I might as well have insulted the Queen, it had such an effect on them. One of them actually screamed. The last thing they wanted to hear, apparently, was one of their competitors saying he was going to win. Admittedly, I said it more out of bravado than in belief I could do it. But in Cold War terms, the Irish had put one over on the British again. On the 22nd of November, the opening ceremony of the 1956 Olympics took place. Teams from 67 nations paraded into the Olympic Stadium before a crowd of over 100,000. Even if one were never to win an Olympic medal, the memory of the opening ceremony would last a lifetime. Somehow, every athlete I have spoken to on the subject has expressed the same sentiment. There is something very special, historic, and significant in being sent by your country to an Olympic Games. And this realization comes to you as you participate in the opening ceremony before the eyes of the world. The taking of the Olympic oath, the fanfares of trumpets, the choirs, the lighting of the Olympic flame, the releasing of the doves of peace carrying their message that the Games are on, all combine to make a great spectacle. And an undying impression on the mind of the participants. I was proud of my heritage and my native land as I stood erect in the Olympic Stadium, a privileged member of the Irish team. I was not due to run until a week later in the preliminary heats of the 1500 metres. I did not go to the track and field events for more than an hour each day. I found the tension too great. I had the thrill of seeing Charlie Jenkins win the 400-metre crown and believed I could have won the high jump with my exultant leap as he breasted the tape. The days flew by, and I was preparing myself mentally for the task ahead. I reasoned I was as fit and strong as anyone in the race. I was faster than most over a half mile or quarter, and a 4-minute miler to boot. I believed I had it in me to win. I was almost alone in this opinion, except for my coach, my family, and my closest friends. No one looked for the reason for my defeats. The fact that I was spiked in Paris and out of training for 3 weeks was completely ignored. In retrospect, it is probably a good thing not to be favoured. The heats of the 1500 metres were held on Thursday, but qualifying for the final turned out to be a mere formality. The first 4 in each of the 3 heats went on to the final on Saturday. I strolled home in 3rd place in my heat comfortably, behind Merv Lincoln of Australia and Ken Wood of Great Britain. The much favoured Tabori of Hungary was in the 4th spot. Rosavalli, the world record holder, was eliminated. The final was wide open despite Landy's position as favourite. There were 4 other 4-minute milers in the field besides myself. Landy, Hewson, Tabori, and Nielsen. And I was younger than any of them. Hallberg and Scott of New Zealand were comparatively inexperienced. Lincoln of Australia had probably run too fast in winning his heat. Rixenhain of Germany and Youngworth of Czechoslovakia were unknown quantities. Of the other 2 Britons in the race, Wood was considered a dark horse, but Boyd hardly seemed up to the class of the race. Friday was spent resting and relaxing as far as possible under the trying circumstances. Every moment my mind was turning over, analysing my opponents. It was virtually impossible to decide on the form of the field. Finally, I settled to my own satisfaction that Landy was still my greatest threat. Hewson was the next most likely to succeed in beating me to my life's ambition. I also considered the possibility of an outsider of the inspired sort who suddenly appears in the Olympic finals and performs way above himself, running off with the laurels. It was this sort of inspiration I was hoping for myself. The day I had lived for dawned bright and warm. It was difficult to remain calm, but I tried as best I could, for I knew every moment anxiety used up valuable energy. I resigned myself quietly to the will of God. I prayed not so much for victory, but the grace to run my best. When I arrived at the Olympic Stadium, I immediately went to the warm-up area for the roll call and to prepare for my race. One of the first people I met was Charlie Jenkins. In spite of the seriousness of the occasion for me, he could not restrain himself from bursting into laughter when he saw the anxiety written all over my face. I will always remember what he said to me. "Man, I know what you are going through. I am sure glad my ordeal is over." He could well laugh with his Olympic gold medal already secured, and with the possibility of another before him in the 16-metre relay final later in the day. Before I fully realised it, the race was called. We were marched single file through a dark tunnel, out into the sudden glaring brightness of the Olympic Oval, before 100,000 partisan fans ready to cheer on their hero, John Landy. Yet, as we moved across the stadium towards the starting area, John came over to me and wished me good luck. It was typical of this great sportsman. It is funny how, even in life's most serious moments, one cannot help being amused by some little detail. The three British athletes were moving around as if they were glued together, all ashen-faced and looking as if they were going to the gallows rather than the starting line. I remember reprimanding myself and thinking I would not be so amused if one of these Englishmen were ahead of me at the finish. There was one false start. We were lined up again. The pistol fired and the Olympic 1500-metre final was on. In a crowded field of 12, one had to avoid trouble, and I did this by running at the back of the pack. After 400 metres in 58.9 seconds, Hallberg was leading, with Hewson nicely placed and a bunched field right behind. Lincoln took the lead at the 800-metre mark in 2:00.3, with his fellow Australian Landy last and myself just in front of him. At the bell, the entire field was fantastically gathered within a mere 6 yards. Lincoln, Hewson and Richtenhein were in the lead. I was back in 10th place, but I was very much in touch with the leaders. The pace at this stage of the race was not troubling me. I knew I could not afford to allow anyone to break into a lead at this vital stage of the race, so I moved out wide to allow myself a clear run. About 350 yards from the finish, as we went down the back stretch for the last time, Hewson was forging away in the lead. Suddenly, Landy sprinted. I reacted immediately, slipping into his wake, following him as we passed the struggling figures of the other competitors. I knew if I were to win, I would have to make one and only one decisive move. I restrained myself as long as possible, and about 150 yards from the finish, I opened up with everything I had. Within 10 yards, I was in the lead and going away from the field. I knew nobody was going to pass me, for my legs were pumping like pistons, tired but not going to give in to anybody. My heart swelled with joy as I approached the tape, 10 feet clear of the rest of the field. As I burst through, I threw my arms wide in exultation. I could hardly believe I had won. My eyes swelled with tears, and I dropped to my knees in a prayer of thanksgiving. John Landy, who finished third, came over to me, helped me to my feet, and warmly congratulated me. The Australian crowd was showing its sportsmanship by generously applauding me. It was the happiest day of my life.
If reading, writing, maths or technology is holding you back, free phone 1800 20 20 65 to see how we can help.